Bride cancels wedding after seeing groom's secret past revealed in a photo. Emma had always believed in the power of dreams. Raised in a small town by loving but modest parents, she grew up with a simple yet strong sense of what made life meaningful. Her parents instilled in her the values of integrity, kindness, and perseverance, teaching her to appreciate the little things, like the smell of fresh-baked cookies or the warmth of a cozy home. But even in the midst of this idyllic childhood, Emma's heart yearned for something more, something grander than the quiet world she inhabited. She imagined a life of love and adventure, the kind that she had only read about in books or seen in movies. Before we can continue, if you love your family, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. It wasn't that Emma didn't appreciate the life she had.
She did.
But there was always a longing inside her for a connection that transcended the ordinary. It was a longing for a partner who would make her feel seen, who would understand the depths of her heart, and who would stand by her side through all the trials and triumphs of life. Emma had always dreamed of finding someone who would make her world complete, someone who would sweep her off her feet and show her a life full of excitement, passion, and stability. When she first met Mark, it felt like all her dreams had come true. Mark was everything she had imagined in a partner. Handsome, charming, and deeply thoughtful. He was the kind of man who remembered the little details, who noticed the way her eyes lit up when she talked about her passions, and who always made her feel like she was the most important person in his world. From their very first date, Mark seemed like the perfect match, the kind of man she had always hoped for but never truly expected to find. They met at a mutual friend's party, a casual get-together that neither of them had initially planned to attend. Emma had almost stayed home that evening, but something inside her told her to go. And when she walked into the crowded room, there he was, Mark, standing in the corner, his easy smile drawing her in. He had an air of confidence, but it wasn't the kind that was boastful or overbearing. It was a quiet, assured confidence, the kind that made you feel comfortable just being around him. The moment they started talking, Emma felt an undeniable connection. They spoke for hours, the conversation flowing effortlessly between them. There was an instant sense of understanding, as though they had known each other for years rather than minutes. Emma found herself captivated by Mark's intelligence and his passion for life. He was deeply interested in the world around him, his work, his hobbies, and his ambitions, and he was equally eager to learn about Emma's dreams and aspirations. It was clear from the start that they both wanted the same things, a life filled with love, companionship, and shared experiences. Over the next few weeks, their bond deepened. They spent time together almost every day, getting to know each other in ways that felt both exhilarating and comfortable. There was a natural rhythm to their relationship, one that seemed to flow effortlessly between them. Mark was attentive, always putting Emma's needs before his own, making sure that she felt valued and appreciated at all times. He remembered every small detail about her, from the way she liked her coffee to the songs that made her heart sing. Emma couldn't help but feel like she had found her perfect match, someone who understood her in ways that no one else ever had. Mark's presence in Emma's life became a source of joy and comfort. He was there for her when she faced challenges at work, offering support and encouragement whenever she needed it. When Emma faced moments of self-doubt, Mark was always there to lift her up, reminding her of her worth and strength. His kindness and patience were unwavering, and Emma often found herself wondering how she had gotten so lucky to find someone like him. It wasn't long before they began to talk about the future. Their conversations shifted from the present moment to the long-term plans they both envisioned. They dreamed about the places they would visit, the home they would build, and the family they would one day have. Mark was always so clear about his intentions, about how deeply he cared for Emma and how excited he was to share his life with her. It felt as though everything was falling perfectly into place. As their relationship continued to blossom, Emma couldn't help but feel like she was living in a fairy tale. Mark was not only everything she had hoped for, but he also made her feel like the most cherished woman in the world. His affection was constant, whether it was through thoughtful gestures or simple acts of kindness. Every morning, he left sweet notes for her to find, reminding her of how much he loved her. At night, he would often call her just to say goodnight, making sure she went to bed knowing how much she meant to him. These small acts of love reassured Emma that she had found a man who would be by her side, no matter what. The day Mark proposed was the culmination of everything Emma had ever hoped for. They had been dating for just over a year, and it was clear to both of them that they were ready to take the next step in their relationship. It was a chilly evening, and they were at one of Emma's favorite restaurants, a cozy little bistro with soft lighting and a warm, inviting atmosphere. Mark had planned everything meticulously. He had arranged for a private dinner, complete with candles and soft music playing in the background. The waiter brought over a small velvet box, and before Emma could react, Mark was on one knee, looking up at her with the most tender expression on his face. "Emma, will you marry me?" Mark asked, his voice filled with emotion. "Will you make every day of my life complete?" Tears welled up in Emma's eyes as she nodded, unable to speak for a moment. It was as if time had stopped in that instant, and all the dreams she had ever had about love, marriage, and a family suddenly felt within reach. She said yes, her heart swelling with happiness as she realized that the man she loved had just made the most incredible promise to her. Their engagement was the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. They started making plans for their wedding, choosing the perfect venue, picking out dresses, and selecting a photographer to capture the moments of their special day. Emma was thrilled about the future they were creating together. Everything was going according to plan. She was living a life she had always dreamed of, and Mark was the man who made it all possible. The days leading up to the wedding were filled with excitement and anticipation. Emma felt like the luckiest woman alive, knowing that soon she would be walking down the aisle to marry the man of her dreams. She spent her days planning and organizing every detail, ensuring that the day would be perfect. Mark was just as enthusiastic about the wedding, and the two of them worked together to bring their vision to life. It felt as though nothing could go wrong. But even in the midst of her joy, Emma felt a small, lingering sense of unease. It wasn't that she had any doubts about Mark or their relationship. He had always been honest and loving, and she trusted him completely. But deep down, Emma knew that life wasn't always as perfect as it seemed. She had grown up knowing that things could change in an instant. The world was unpredictable, and sometimes the things we thought we knew about people could be turned upside down. Still, Emma dismissed the thought. She had found the love of her life, and nothing was going to spoil their happiness. Little did Emma know, the perfect life she had so carefully built with Mark was about to unravel in the most unexpected and shocking way. A single moment, one photograph, would challenge everything she thought she knew about the man she was about to marry. Her life, which had seemed so perfectly planned, would soon be in turmoil, and the path to her future would be thrown into question. But Emma had no way of knowing this yet. She was still caught in the bliss of their love story, unaware that the cracks in their perfect world were beginning to form. As Emma stood before the large mirror in the bridal suite, adjusting her veil for what felt like the 100th time, she couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation growing within her. The day she had dreamed of for years was finally here. The church was beautifully decorated with soft white flowers, and the sound of soft music drifted through the air, adding to the sense of magic that seemed to surround her. She could hear the voices of her friends and family in the distance, all buzzing with excitement for the ceremony that was about to take place. Mark had always been her rock, steady, reliable, and incredibly loving. He had made her feel safe and cherished in ways she hadn't even known were possible. The future they had envisioned together seemed like a perfect continuation of the life they were building. They had talked about it for hours, their honeymoon in a secluded beach town, the small house in the countryside they would buy someday, and the family they dreamed of raising together. Emma had always imagined her life with Mark as one of stability and joy. He was the man she could rely on, the man she could trust, and above all, the man she loved deeply. Yet, as Emma looked at herself in the mirror, a small knot of unease settled in her stomach. It wasn't the usual pre-wedding jitters, the kind of nerves that everyone experiences before such a monumental life event. No, this was something different. Something that she couldn't quite put her finger on. It was a subtle feeling, a whisper of doubt that crept into her thoughts when she wasn't expecting it. She had been feeling it for the past few days, a nagging sensation that maybe, just maybe, things weren't as perfect as they seemed. It wasn't that Emma didn't trust Mark.
She did.
And she loved him with every fiber of her being. But there was something in the air, something she couldn't ignore. It started when she overheard a conversation between some of Mark's old friends at his bachelor party a few nights earlier. The laughter and joviality filled the room, but one particular comment made her pause. One of Mark's friends had made a passing remark about the old days and how they were all so much wilder back then. Emma had laughed it off at the time, thinking it was just some harmless teasing, but the more she thought about it, the more it nagged at her. The old days, Mark's friend referred to, seemed like something from a distant past, but there was something unsettling about the way the comment was made. After the party, Emma found herself lying awake in bed, her mind racing with questions. What did Mark's friends mean? What was it about his past that seemed to linger, like an unspoken shadow? She had never pressed Mark too much about his past. They had talked about their childhoods, their families, their dreams for the future, but Mark had always been somewhat reserved when it came to discussing the details of his younger years. Emma had assumed that it was just a part of who he was, private, and not overly nostalgic about the past. But now, as she lay there in the quiet of the night, she wondered if there was more to Mark's story than he had let on. The more she thought about it, the more uneasy she became. Could there have been something in his past that he wasn't telling her? Something that could change everything she thought she knew about him? She pushed the thought away, telling herself that it was nothing. It was just pre-wedding nerves, she reassured herself. After all, Mark was the man she loved, and he had never given her any reason to doubt him. But no matter how hard she tried to silence the thoughts, they kept creeping back in. That afternoon, just hours before the ceremony, Emma found herself at a small gathering with some of Mark's old friends. They were chatting in the living room of the bridal suite, enjoying drinks and light-hearted conversation. Emma was still trying to shake the feeling of doubt that had settled in her heart, but she couldn't seem to shake it. She smiled politely as they reminisced about their college years, Mark's various adventures, and the funny memories they shared. But as she scanned a room, her eyes landed on an old photo album sitting on the coffee table. It was an album that belonged to Mark, filled with images from his youth. Emma felt an inexplicable pull toward it. She had seen the album before, of course, but something about it now felt different. There was a certain urgency, a need to understand the man she was about to marry on a deeper level. She had seen glimpses of his past, his family vacations, pictures of him at sporting events, and moments with friends that he had shared with her. But this album was different. It was older, more personal. The edges of the pages were worn, and the photographs inside seemed to carry a weight of their own. Without thinking, Emma picked up the album and began flipping through the pages. At first, the photos were innocent enough. Pictures of Mark with his childhood friends, his family at holiday gatherings, and moments captured during his teenage years. But then, on the next page, she froze. There, in the center of the page, was a photo that made her blood run cold. It was a picture of Mark, his face half obscured by shadows, standing in front of a building that looked strangely familiar. It wasn't the picture itself that sent a chill down Emma's spine. It was the look in Mark's eyes. There was something about the way he looked in that photo that didn't match the man she knew. It was as if a part of him, something deep and hidden, was visible in that moment. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what was written in the caption beneath the photo. Mark at the old hangout spot. Good times with the crew. Emma's heart skipped a beat. The term crew was something Mark had never mentioned before. He had always talked about his friends, but he had never referred to them as a crew. It felt wrong. And the building in the background. Emma recognized it now. It was a rundown warehouse on the outskirts of town, a place that was infamous for its association with criminal activity in the past. Her fingers trembled as she turned the page, hoping that it was just a misunderstanding. But as she flipped through more pictures, she saw more signs of a past that was far darker than she had ever imagined. There were photos of Mark with a group of people, standing together in front of a graffiti-covered wall. In one of the pictures, Mark was holding what appeared to be a bottle of alcohol, his expression one of defiance. Emma's stomach churned as she realized that these were not the images of the man she had come to know and love. These were the images of someone who seemed to be living a completely different life, one that was filled with rebellion and reckless choices. Her mind raced, and a sense of panic began to creep in. What was this? Who was Mark really? How could she have been so blind to all of this? She had been so sure of him, so certain that their future together was going to be everything she had dreamed of. But now, she wasn't sure what to believe anymore. Suddenly, the room seemed to close in around her. The sound of her friends laughing faded into the background, and all Emma could focus on was the growing fear in her chest. She needed answers. She needed to understand what was going on. But more than anything, she needed to know who Mark really was. Emma's hand trembled slightly as she closed the photo album, her mind struggling to make sense of the image she had just seen. The room around her seemed to spin, the noise of the gathering fading into a distant hum as her thoughts raced uncontrollably. Her eyes moved to the faces of the other guests, unaware of the storm that was now brewing inside her. They chatted and laughed, oblivious to the bombshell Emma had just unearthed. The photo she had found had shattered the image of Mark she had built over the past 2 years. In that brief moment of shocking recognition, the perfect man she was about to marry had become a stranger. The photo had been innocuous at first, just one of many images shared by Mark's old college friends during their gathering. Mark, the seemingly kind and gentle man she had come to love, was laughing in the picture. But the moment her eyes caught the details, the setting, the people surrounding him, and the deep, almost haunted look in his eyes, she knew something was terribly wrong. This wasn't the man she knew. The people in that picture were not just friends or acquaintances. They were members of a group she had heard whispers about, a group tied to dangerous activities in the past. Emma's initial shock was quickly replaced by suspicion, and then a burning curiosity. There were so many questions, and her mind felt like it was unraveling with each one. How had Mark been involved with such a group? Why had he never mentioned it? And most importantly, why had he hidden it from her, especially when they were about to commit to a life together? Emma felt the anger rising in her chest, but beneath it was a profound sense of fear. Fear not just for what she might discover, but for what it could mean for their future. She couldn't confront him right away. Emma knew herself too well. Her emotions were raw, and if she spoke to him now, there was a chance her words would be too harsh. She needed to understand more before confronting Mark. She needed to know the full extent of his involvement in whatever dangerous activities this group had been engaged in. This would be the start of an investigation, a journey into Mark's past, a past he had deliberately kept from her, and she would have to walk it alone. Emma had never considered herself a detective. She had always prided herself on being straightforward, on talking through problems and trusting the people around her. But now, she found herself in unfamiliar territory. She had no idea where to start, but she knew she couldn't just sit back and pretend nothing had happened. Emma had been ready to marry this man, to build a life with him, but everything had changed in an instant. The truth, whatever it was, had to be uncovered. Her first step was obvious. She needed more information. She had already seen that Mark was somehow connected to the mysterious group in the photo, but she couldn't simply go to him and ask, at least not yet. There was too much at stake, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for the truth he might reveal. So, Emma did what anyone in the digital age would do when faced with uncertainty. She turned to the internet. The web could be a treasure trove of information, and Emma hoped it would provide some answers. She started with a simple search, Mark's full name and the city where he had grown up. Her first search yielded little more than basic details, his social media profiles, old university connections, and a few mentions here and there, none of which seemed relevant to the troubling photo. But Emma's resolve only deepened. She was determined to find something, anything, that would give her insight into Mark's past. Her second search, however, proved more fruitful. A local news article from several years ago caught her eye. It wasn't about Mark directly, but it mentioned a group that had been active in the city, a group of young people involved in petty crime, violence, and drugs. Emma's pulse quickened as she read the article. The group had been notorious for its secrecy and the sense of loyalty among its members, and while many had been arrested, a few had escaped justice. The mention of a dilapidated warehouse in a rundown part of town stood out to Emma. It was the same warehouse she had recognized from the photo. Her heart sank. The warehouse was familiar, and it sent a chill down her spine. She had seen it in the background of that photo, where Mark had stood, surrounded by people she now realized were likely part of this dangerous group. But Emma needed more than just these vague details. She needed to know if Mark had been involved. Could he really have been a part of something like this? If he had, how much did he know? How far had he gone? Emma's stomach twisted with dread, but she couldn't back away now. She needed answers. Over the following days, Emma threw herself into the search. She spoke to people who had grown up with Mark, acquaintances from his past who might hold the key to unlocking the truth. At first, her attempts were met with reluctance. People were evasive, offering only vague recollections or outright denying any knowledge of Mark's involvement in anything criminal. But the more she pushed, the more she uncovered. One name came up repeatedly in her inquiries: Greg, Mark's childhood friend. Greg had been a constant figure in Mark's stories, someone who had always been by his side through thick and thin. They had been inseparable in their youth, and even as adults, Mark kept in regular contact with him. Emma's pulse raced as she turned her attention to Greg. If anyone could reveal the truth about Mark's past, it was Greg. She found an old social media account belonging to him and sent a message, carefully worded, hoping to gather any information she could. She didn't mention Mark directly, but she asked about the group and the warehouse, and whether Greg had any insight into what had really happened. The response she received was short and cryptic. "I don't know what you're talking about. Mark's a good guy. He's changed." That response did little to calm Emma's growing anxiety. The dismissal in Greg's message only made Emma more certain that there was something being hidden from her, something that had been buried beneath layers of time and secrecy. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was uncovering a dark side of Mark, one that she wasn't prepared for. Her investigation didn't end there. Emma continued to dig, scouring news reports and talking to more of Mark's old friends. Slowly, the details came together. Mark had been a member of the group, and while he hadn't been the ringleader, he had certainly been involved. The group's activities had escalated from minor offenses to more serious crimes. Drugs, theft, and vandalism had been their stock in trade. Emma couldn't help but feel betrayed as she pieced together the fragments of Mark's past. The man she had thought she knew so well had been part of something much darker. But there were still questions left unanswered. Had Mark been involved in the worst of it? Was he truly a different person now, or had he simply hidden his past well enough to fool her? And most importantly, could Emma continue to trust him knowing what she now knew? As the days passed, Emma found herself consumed by the search for answers. Every new discovery only deepened her confusion and fear. She had wanted to believe in Mark, to believe that the man she was about to marry was the man she had come to love. But the more she uncovered, the more she realized that she might not have known him at all. One evening, as she sat alone in her apartment, Emma's phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize, but the voice on the other end was unmistakable. It was Mark. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that Emma hadn't heard before. "Emma," Mark said, his tone gentle but firm, "we need to talk." At that moment, Emma knew the time had come. The truth was no longer something she could avoid. She would have to face Mark, face the man he had once been, and decide if she could still love the man he had become. This was the moment of reckoning, and Emma had no idea where it would lead. Emma stood by the window, staring at the street below as the days blurred into one another. Her mind felt like a battleground, a place where opposing forces, her love for Mark and the truth about his past, fought for dominance. She had never been one to dwell on problems for long. She liked to fix things, to solve issues before they could fester. But this was different. This wasn't a problem she could simply solve with logic or willpower. This was a matter of trust, of something so fundamental that Emma didn't know where to start in putting the pieces of her life back together. The weight of her discovery was suffocating. Emma had thought that once she confronted the truth about Mark's past, she would have a clear path forward. But what she found was more like a tangled web that she couldn't quite escape from. The longer she searched for answers, the more confused and conflicted she became. The person she had known for 2 years, the man she had been ready to marry, seemed to be slipping away from her, replaced by a stranger with a dark history that she couldn't reconcile with the loving, gentle man she saw every day. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon when Mark finally called, his voice steady but carrying an undertone of urgency. "Emma," he said, "I know you've been looking into things. We need to talk." His words felt like a stone dropping into her chest, a reminder of the emotional chasm that had opened between them. She had been waiting for this moment, yet now that it had arrived, Emma wasn't sure she was ready to hear what he had to say. She agreed to meet him at their favorite cafe, the one where they had first met. Emma needed a place that was neutral, a place where she could think clearly, where emotions hadn't yet tainted the memory of their love. Mark had always been a patient listener, someone who spoke with kindness and clarity. But the thought of hearing him explain the secrets he had kept from her made her stomach turn. Would he deny everything? Would he lie? Or would he finally come clean? No matter what happened, Emma knew that this conversation would be the defining moment of their relationship. The cafe was quiet when Emma arrived, the hum of soft conversation and the clink of cups blending into the background as she took a seat by the window. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions, anger, confusion, betrayal, but she held it all in check, trying to remain calm. Mark was late, and with every passing minute, Emma's anxiety grew. She had thought she was prepared for this moment, but as the time ticked by, she realized just how unprepared she truly was. She had no idea what would happen next. Would she be able to look him in the eyes and still see the man she had fallen in love with? Or would she see only a liar, a man whose secrets were so deep that they could never be buried again? When Mark finally walked through the door, his presence seemed to fill the room. He had always carried himself with a quiet confidence, but today he seemed different, more fragile, as though he knew that everything hung in the balance. His eyes met Emma's, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. There was so much unsaid between them, so much that neither of them could yet put into words. Emma felt a lump rise in her throat, but she swallowed it down, forcing herself to remain composed. She had questioned so many questions, and she needed answers. The truth had already shattered her trust, but she needed to hear it from his lips. Mark took a seat across from her, his hands nervously folding and unfolding on the table. His usual calm demeanor was gone, replaced by an unease that was hard to ignore. "I didn't want you to find out this way," he began, his voice low. "I was trying to protect you from my past. I should have told you sooner, but I didn't know how. I thought that if I just kept moving forward, we could leave it all behind." Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she listened. The words were what she had expected to hear, but hearing them out loud, from his lips, was a different experience entirely. She felt a wave of emotions rise up within her, frustration, hurt, but also a deep sadness. She had known Mark long enough to understand that he wasn't a bad person. He had always been kind, patient, and loving. But now, that same man was sitting in front of her, admitting to things she couldn't even fully grasp yet. "I didn't get involved in everything they did," Mark continued, his voice faltering. "But I was part of it. I was there when things went too far. I did things I'm not proud of, things I wish I could take back." His gaze dropped to the table, his eyes clouded with guilt. Emma's stomach twisted at the admission. She had suspected that Mark's involvement had been more than just a passing phase, but hearing him confirm it in such a raw, vulnerable way hit harder than she had imagined. "You lied to me," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. The words hung heavy in the air between them. "You hid this from me. For 2 years, you let me believe that everything about you is perfect. And now I find out that you were part of something dangerous, something criminal." Mark flinched at her words, his eyes meeting hers with a pained expression. "I know," he said quietly. "I know I've betrayed your trust, and I don't expect you to forgive me. But I need you to understand that I'm not that person anymore. I've changed. I left that life behind when I met you. You were the reason I wanted to change, the reason I thought I could be better." Emma shook her head, her mind reeling from the torrent of emotions crashing over her. She had always believed that love could change people, that it could heal wounds and rebuild broken pieces. But now, sitting in front of Mark, Emma wasn't so sure. How could she believe that someone who had lied to her for so long could suddenly change? How could she trust him when his past was full of such lies and deceit? The conversation that followed was a blur of words, emotions, and silence. Emma didn't know how long they sat there, talking in circles, both of them trying to make sense of the impossible situation they had found themselves in. At times, it felt like they were speaking two different languages. Mark's attempts to explain himself, to justify his past actions, only seemed to deepen the rift between them. Every time he spoke of his past, it felt like another wall went up between them. Emma wanted to believe that he had changed, but the more she heard, the more she realized that change was never as simple as Mark made it sound. But perhaps the most painful realization came when Emma looked into Mark's eyes and saw the desperation there, the desperation of a man who had never truly faced the consequences of his past, a man who had spent years hiding from the truth. She could see that he loved her, that he wanted to move forward, but Emma was beginning to understand that love alone couldn't erase the damage that had been done. The foundation of their relationship, built on trust and honesty, had been shattered. Over the next few days, Emma found herself pulled in different directions. She loved Mark more than she had ever loved anyone, but she didn't know if she could live with the weight of his secrets. The guilt that she felt for questioning his sincerity, for doubting his intentions, gnawed at her. But at the same time, she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that she was being asked to sacrifice too much. The man she had fallen in love with wasn't perfect, no one was, but his past had opened a door to a darkness that she wasn't sure she could walk through. The hardest part, Emma realized, was that she wasn't sure she could forgive him. She wasn't sure she could ever look at him the same way again. And that realization cut deeper than anything else. Emma stood at the altar, her heart racing in her chest as she exchanged vows with Mark. The church was filled with light, music played softly in the background, and all eyes were on them as they stood side by side, holding hands. It should have been a moment of pure happiness, a culmination of their love story, but all Emma could feel was a deep sense of unease. The decision to move forward with the wedding, despite everything she had learned about Mark's past, felt more like a betrayal of her own feelings than a triumph. Throughout the ceremony, Emma's mind kept drifting back to the conversation she had had with Mark just days earlier. The revelations about his involvement in a group with dubious activities, questionable decisions, and potential crimes had weighed heavily on her. It was hard to reconcile the man she loved with the person he had been in his youth. And yet, here she was, reciting her vows with a wavering voice, forcing herself to believe that love and forgiveness were enough to heal their relationship. As the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Emma's throat tightened and she fought back tears. It felt as though she was putting on a mask, pretending everything was okay. The strength of her commitment to Mark, her desire to move past the past, was faltering with every beat of her heart. She wondered if it would be enough to sustain their relationship. Could she truly ignore the deep well of doubt that had been growing inside her since discovering Mark's past? After the ceremony, the reception was bustling with family, friends, and guests. There was laughter, music, dancing, and plenty of food and drinks. Everyone seemed genuinely happy and delighted to celebrate their love. And yet, for Emma, the joy felt superficial, as though she were observing someone else's life rather than living her own. She found herself drifting from conversation to conversation, responding with polite smiles and forced enthusiasm. It was exhausting, and the longer the night went on, the more Emma realized that she was hiding her true feelings from everyone, including herself. Mark noticed Emma's distant demeanor and pulled her aside during one of the quieter moments of the reception. "Hey, are you okay?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. His eyes searched hers, hoping to find reassurance and comfort. But Emma couldn't bring herself to meet his gaze. Instead, she looked down at her hands, fidgeting with the lace of her wedding dress. "I'm fine," she replied, forcing a smile. "I'm just a little tired, that's all." But her words felt hollow, even to her own ears. Deep down, she knew she was lying. The unease inside her was much deeper and more pervasive than simple exhaustion. Mark took her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "We can talk later, okay? I just want you to know that I love you, and I'm here for you no matter what," he said, his voice earnest and sincere. Emma nodded, unable to find the words to express how conflicted she felt. She wanted to believe him, to believe that their love could overcome the challenges they were facing, but doubts lingered at the edges of her mind. As the night wore on, Emma watched her friends and family toast to their happiness, their words ringing hollow in her ears. All around her, people were raising glasses and laughing, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was as if she were living in two separate realities, one where everything was perfect and one where the truth of Mark's past loomed large and unspoken. The dichotomy felt unbearable, and Emma realized that she couldn't continue living in this tension without something giving way. At the height of the reception, as the DJ played a slow song, Emma saw Mark approach her with a radiant smile on his face. He took her hand and pulled her onto the dance floor. The two of them began to sway to the music, surrounded by the hum of conversation and the twinkling lights of the reception hall. But Emma couldn't focus on the rhythm or the feeling of Mark's arms around her. Her mind drifted to the uncertainty she felt in her gut, and the more she tried to push it away, the more it intensified. When Mark leaned in to whisper something in her ear, perhaps words of reassurance, promises of a brighter future, Emma felt a sudden pang of realization. She was fooling herself, she realized. She was chasing after a mirage, pretending that their relationship was whole and unbroken when it was anything but. Mark's past was not something that could be ignored or brushed under the rug. It was a fundamental part of who he was, and Emma couldn't escape it, no matter how much she wanted to. As they danced, Emma's mind replayed the image of the photo she had seen in Mark's old album, the one that had started this whole journey. It showed Mark in a different context, a different time, surrounded by unfamiliar faces with expressions that conveyed a sense of danger and secrecy. She couldn't shake the feeling that this person was not the man standing in front of her, holding her close. The dissonance between who Mark was now and who he had been in the past felt irreconcilable. Finally, unable to keep up the pretense any longer, Emma broke away from Mark and stepped off the dance floor. Mark looked startled, confused by her sudden movement, but Emma couldn't bring herself to explain. Instead, she walked to the bathroom, where she looked at herself in the mirror, seeing the reflection of a bride who seemed to be nothing more than an actress in her own wedding. Tears filled her eyes as she realized that she had never truly wanted this. She had been chasing an ideal that didn't exist. Deep down, she understood that she was still grappling with her feelings for Mark, but more importantly, she was struggling with the recognition that the person she had chosen to marry was not someone she could trust fully. As she gathered her composure, Emma realized that she had to make a choice, and it was a difficult one. Should she continue down this path, allowing herself to be pulled along by the momentum of the wedding, or should she confront the reality that her relationship with Mark might not be as strong as she had believed? The false sense of victory that had been the culmination of their wedding day was beginning to crumble, and Emma realized that it was time to face the truth. When she returned to the reception hall, Mark was waiting for her, his eyes wide with anticipation and hope. He approached her with a hopeful expression, his hand reaching out to take hers. But Emma didn't take it. Instead, she took a deep breath and made a decision. It was time to end the wedding. The doubt and uncertainty she had been feeling since discovering Mark's past had finally reached its breaking point. She realized that the facade she had built around their relationship could no longer stand, and the only path forward was honesty and self-awareness. Turning to Mark, Emma took a deep breath and said, "I can't do this anymore." Her voice was steady, but her heart was breaking. The man she had once planned to spend her life with looked shocked, but there was no anger or resentment in his expression, just confusion and pain. Emma felt a surge of relief, mixed with grief. It was over, and there was no turning back. The relationship they had worked so hard to maintain, the one they had built on love and trust, was crumbling before their eyes. The reception continued around them, people celebrating and dancing as though nothing had changed. But for Emma, everything had shifted. The illusion of their perfect relationship had been shattered, and she was left to face the reality of her decision. She walked away from Mark, her heart pounding, feeling more certain than ever that she had made the right choice. Despite the pain and confusion, she realized that letting go of the false victory was the first step toward healing and finding peace. As she walked out of the reception hall, leaving Mark standing alone in the midst of the celebration, Emma realized that this was not just the end of her relationship with him, it was the beginning of a new chapter in her own life. Armed with the painful clarity that came from confronting the truth, she walked away resolute, ready to face whatever came next. It was a journey that would be fraught with difficulty, but it was also one that promised the potential for growth, self-discovery, and finding true happiness. Emma walked out of the reception hall, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridor, each step taking her further away from the life she had once envisioned with Mark. The night had turned into a whirlwind of emotions, leaving her drained and uncertain. The weight of her decision to cancel the wedding was pressing on her chest like a heavy stone. As the door to the venue swung closed behind her, she felt a deep sense of finality that both frightened and liberated her. She had chosen to face the truth, no matter the cost. The drive back to her apartment was a blur. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white, as the sound of tires against the asphalt was the only noise filling the car. In the solitude of the night, Emma found herself battling a storm of emotions: regret, guilt, relief, and fear, each one vying for dominance. She could hear Mark's voice in her mind, asking her to reconsider, begging her to give their relationship another chance. The memory of his face, confused and hurt, haunted her thoughts. She had never wanted to hurt him. She had loved him once, perhaps still did in some capacity, but the cracks in their relationship had become impossible to ignore. As she pulled into the parking lot of her building and turned off the engine, Emma sat there for a moment, gathering herself. The silence in the car seemed to echo her internal turmoil, and she could feel the sting of tears welling in her eyes. She had made the right decision, she reminded herself. She had to believe that. But as she stepped out of the car and walked toward her apartment, she could feel the weight of her choice bearing down on her with an intensity she hadn't anticipated. The apartment was quiet when she entered, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the stillness. Emma dropped her purse on the table and collapsed onto the couch, her head spinning. She had just walked away from everything: her dreams of a perfect wedding, her hopes for a future with Mark, the life she had been planning for months. The cost of this decision felt astronomical, and Emma could not help but wonder if she would ever find the strength to rebuild what she had lost. Her phone buzzed with a text message, and she glanced at the screen to see Mark's name. The message read, "Emma, we need to talk. Please don't do this. I'm not who you think I am. Let's sit down and figure this out." Her heart twisted as she read the words. She knew the message came from a place of desperation, of wanting to salvage what they had, but Emma also knew that she could no longer keep pretending. Their relationship had been built on fragile ground, and the foundation had cracked beneath their feet. Emma's thumb hovered over the reply button for a moment, but she knew there was nothing she could say that would make things better. No words could undo the harm that had been done. No conversation could erase the doubts that had plagued her. She had confronted Mark's past, and the truth had not been what she had hoped for. She had believed that love could overcome anything, that it could heal all wounds, but love alone wasn't enough to overcome betrayal, secrets, and deception. She put the phone down on the coffee table and leaned back, closing her eyes. She thought about how things had been before all of this: the moments of joy, the laughter, the shared dreams. She had loved Mark with all her heart. But now, she realized that love was not the only thing that mattered in a relationship. Trust, honesty, and respect were the cornerstones that held everything together. And once those were broken, everything else fell apart. The next few days were a blur of silence and introspection. Emma barely left her apartment, retreating into herself as she tried to make sense of everything that had happened. She avoided phone calls and messages from her friends and family, unable to face their well-intentioned but intrusive questions. She didn't want to explain herself to anyone. She couldn't. She wasn't even sure she fully understood her own decision. Every time she thought about Mark, the memories of their good times together came flooding back. She remembered the way he held her hand during their walks in the park, the quiet moments they shared at home, the times he had comforted her when she felt vulnerable. Those memories, once cherished, now felt like painful reminders of a love that had been tainted by deception. And yet, she couldn't deny the tenderness that lingered in her heart for him. The love she had for Mark hadn't disappeared overnight. It had been eroded over time, chipped away by the weight of secrets and lies. Emma tried to focus on herself, to find solace in the solitude she had created. She spent her days reading, journaling, and reflecting on the lessons she had learned from this experience. She had chosen to end the relationship because she knew it was the right thing to do, even if it didn't feel right in the moment. She couldn't ignore the red flags anymore, couldn't continue to live in a world of half-truths and unspoken fears. But the price of her decision was heavy. She had lost not only her future with Mark, but also a sense of stability and certainty she had relied on for so long. As the days turned into weeks, Emma began to notice the ripple effects of her decision. Her friends and family, who had celebrated her wedding only a few days ago, started to reach out, expressing concern and confusion. They had been shocked by her sudden change of heart, and many of them, despite their love for her, were unsure of how to support her. The questions began pouring in, and Emma struggled to find the words to explain herself. How could she tell them that she had realized she was living a lie, that she had seen the cracks in the facade of her relationship too late? Her parents, especially, were devastated by her choice. They had been eagerly anticipating the wedding and had invested so much hope into Emma's future with Mark. When Emma finally spoke to them on the phone, her mother's voice trembled with disbelief. "But Emma, you are so happy with him. You two are perfect for each other. Why are you doing this?" Emma didn't have an easy answer. She had tried to explain the revelations about Mark's past, the things he had kept hidden, the way she had felt betrayed and unsure of his honesty. But her words felt inadequate, as if she were speaking in a language they couldn't understand. How could they comprehend the depth of her internal struggle? How could they know the weight of the decision she had made? The isolation that followed was both a consequence and a necessity. Emma knew she had to go through this process alone, to come to terms with the fallout of her choice and to find a way to heal. But the loneliness was overwhelming. She missed the comfort of Mark's presence, the way he had always been there for her. She missed the way they had shared their lives, their hopes, and their dreams. And yet, she knew that she had made the right decision. The truth, no matter how painful, had to be faced. The heavy price she paid for her decision wasn't just emotional, it was also social. The awkwardness that came with explaining her actions to friends and family, the judgmental looks and questions that followed her in the weeks after the wedding fiasco, left her feeling like an outsider in her own life. It was as though the world had shifted beneath her feet, and Emma had no choice but to find her footing in a new reality that was both unsettling and unfamiliar. Despite all of this, there was a small part of Emma that felt a glimmer of hope. She had chosen her own happiness over the comfort of maintaining a relationship that wasn't built on trust. It was a painful decision, and one that would continue to hurt for some time, but it was also the first step toward reclaiming her sense of self-worth and autonomy. As the days passed, Emma began to realize that sometimes the hardest choices were the ones that led to the greatest personal growth. Even though the price was high, the lessons she had learned would shape her into a stronger, more resilient person. And that, she hoped, would be enough to carry her forward. After the tumultuous weeks that followed the wedding cancellation, Emma found herself standing on the threshold of something both familiar and new. Her life, which had once seemed to follow a predictable trajectory, had been turned upside down, and yet, in some strange way, she felt more herself than she had in a long time. The pain of her decision to call off the wedding still lingered, but it had become something she could bear. It was no longer a weight that crushed her. It was a part of her story, a story that she was beginning to understand more clearly with each passing day. She had spent the last few weeks in solitude, reflecting on the life she had almost had with Mark, on the man she had thought she knew, and on the truth she had discovered that had forever changed everything. Emma had confronted the lies, the secrets, and the fears that had been buried beneath the surface of their relationship. She had realized that love, no matter how deep, could not survive without trust. Mark had broken that trust, and in doing so, had shattered the foundation upon which their future was supposed to be built. Now, as she stood on the edge of a new beginning, Emma felt an uneasy sense of clarity. She had made the right choice, even if it had been the hardest one of her life. She had given up on a dream, a life she had imagined for so long, but in doing so, she had reclaimed something far more precious, her own peace of mind. She had made room for a future that was truly hers, one where she could live without the constant shadow of doubt hanging over her. As Emma stepped back into her daily routine, she was faced with the reality of rebuilding her life. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when the temptation to revert to old habits, old dreams, and old relationships threatened to pull her back into the past. But each time she felt that pull, Emma reminded herself that she had made this choice for a reason. She had chosen to live her life authentically, to face the truths that had been hidden in the darkness, and to no longer settle for less than what she deserved. Her mornings, once filled with plans and hopes of a wedding that never came to be, were now filled with small moments of self-discovery. Emma started going for long walks in the park, a habit she had neglected during the whirlwind of wedding planning. She found solace in the quiet of the morning, in the rhythm of her footsteps on the earth, in the way the light filtered through the trees. She learned to appreciate the peace that came from solitude, from being alone with her thoughts, without the weight of expectations from others. It was in these moments that Emma began to reconnect with herself, with the person she had once been before Mark, before the dream of marriage had consumed her every thought. Her friends, although initially confused and hurt by her decision, began to reach out to her more frequently. They wanted to understand what had happened, to know why she had called off the wedding, but Emma wasn't ready to share all the details yet. She wasn't sure she could explain it in a way that made sense. How could she tell them that it wasn't just the lies, but the realization that she had been living in a relationship built on illusions? How could she tell them that she had chosen her own happiness, even when it meant letting go of someone she had loved deeply? Gradually, her friends started to accept her decision. They didn't fully understand it, but they respected it. They saw the change in Emma, the strength she had gained from facing her fears and confronting the truth. They saw a woman who was no longer willing to live in the shadows of someone else's past, a woman who had chosen to embrace the unknown rather than stay in a relationship that no longer fit her. It wasn't easy, but Emma had learned that sometimes the hardest choices were the ones that led to the most profound growth. One afternoon, several weeks after the cancellation, Emma decided to visit her parents. It had been a difficult conversation with them in the days following her decision. They had been disappointed, confused, and even angry at first. They had always believed that Mark was the one for her, that their relationship was perfect, that their wedding would be the culmination of years of love and planning. To say they had been shocked by Emma's decision would have been an understatement. But as she sat across from her mother at the kitchen table, watching her carefully prepared cup of tea steam in the quiet room, Emma could sense a shift in the air. Her parents were no longer asking her to reconsider, no longer pushing her to find a way to make things work with Mark. They had accepted her choice, even if they didn't fully understand it. Emma's mother, with her quiet wisdom, reached across the table and took Emma's hand in hers. "You did what you thought was right, Emma," her mother said, her voice gentle but firm. "And I respect that. It's not easy, but sometimes life leads us down unexpected paths. The important thing is that you've found your strength." It was in that moment that Emma realized how much she had changed. She had always looked to her parents for validation, for approval, but now she understood that their love for her didn't depend on the decisions she made. It wasn't about whether she had a wedding or a relationship that met their expectations. It was about her own happiness, her own journey. And Emma was beginning to embrace that journey, no matter how uncertain it seemed. As the weeks turned into months, Emma continued to build her life in the wake of the wedding that never was. She focused on her work, finding new projects that inspired her and gave her a sense of fulfillment. She reconnected with old friends, some of whom had been lost in the midst of her whirlwind romance with Mark. Slowly, she began to feel the pieces of her life coming together again, like a puzzle that had been scattered but was now being put back in place. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments of doubt, but Emma had learned to trust herself again. There were times when Emma would find herself thinking of Mark. He would cross her mind unexpectedly, at the grocery store, on a quiet evening at home, during a walk in the park. She would remember the way his smile had once made her heart skip a beat, the way they had shared their dreams of the future. And for a moment, she would ache with the memory of what could have been. But then she would remember why she had made the decision to let go. She had chosen truth over illusion, self-respect over compromise, and peace over uncertainty. One day, while she was out for a walk, Emma ran into one of Mark's old friends. It was an awkward moment at first, as they both stood there, unsure of how to begin the conversation. The friend hesitated before speaking, but when he did, his words were surprisingly kind. "You did the right thing, you know," he said, his voice sincere. "Mark, he's a good guy, but he's got some things he needs to work through. You deserve someone who's honest with you from the start." Emma nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. She had been afraid of running into people who would try to convince her to reconsider, but in this moment, she felt a sense of validation. It was a reminder that she wasn't alone, that she had made the right choice, even when it felt like the hardest thing she'd ever done. In time, Emma came to understand that the decision to walk away from Mark wasn't a failure, it was an act of strength. She had chosen herself, and that was the most important thing. She had faced the darkness of her relationship and emerged on the other side, not unscathed, but wiser, stronger, and more certain of who she was. As she walked into her apartment one evening, after another long day of work, Emma took a moment to pause. She looked around her space, at the life she had built on her own. There was no wedding dress, no flowers, no dream of the future she had once imagined with Mark. But there was something else, something even more important. There was a sense of peace, of self-acceptance, and of the quiet knowledge that Emma was exactly where she was meant to be. She had chosen the harder path, the one less traveled, but it was the one that had led her back to herself. And in that moment, Emma knew that she was finally free.